Hi everybody, I'm Billy, and this is Antioch, Chapter 31, Armageddon. Only one man was fishing off the piers that morning. The other fishermen were either at the festival or sleeping it off. When he saw the warship Vesper on the horizon, he stared at it for a full minute before realizing he'd dropped his good pole into the water. When he noticed his hands were empty, he didn't care. No one's going to believe this. Pirate ships sailed in children's tales by the fire. They didn't exist. He took off up the boards into town, shouting, his brilliant cerulean blue shirt fluttering from his suspenders. "There's a ship on the sea! There's a ship on the sea!" A few merrymakers were curious enough, or drunk enough, to go have a look. Word spread and Moreau started to gather, for the first time ever, to watch a ship come in. And it was coming in fast. They followed the cliff's ridge as a gawking mob, watching as the minutes passed, as that heavy moment built until the ship would crash. Their hands went to their heads with gasps and exclamations. The Vesper's unbelievable bulk hit a full raking stop, breaking its hull on the coast in an explosion of white geysers. Its sails rippled and bent as the crew spilled forward on the momentum over the rails and into the raging collision. The natives rushed down to help, taking familiar paths, and the undead crew saw their coming as stars shooting out of the darkness. The pitching waves couldn't bend the light of Rin. Ink washed in. Then thin, black-eyed pirates crawled out of the spray, bones jutting from their wagging skin and hoops of clothing, smoking from their silently open mouths. Their breath made the wind burn. Moreau ran. They ran back to town, shouting, warning that evil ghosts had risen from the sea. The ignorant watched out of their windows in disbelief, but also in cold dread that they were about to witness what could not be. At those first wiry fiends that scuttled into view on skeletons' hands and feet, many couldn't help but scream. It was already too late for some, those who'd unwittingly brought doom into their homes, in their bodies, and on their clothes. Others chose to stand and fight. They fell. No matter courage, skill, or implements, it was a rout in which the corpses overwhelmed the heroes. Moreauans climbed to the highest parts of their houses and shouted to each other from the rooftops and balconies like they would during a flood, trying to decide what to do. Bowron gathered below the voices. The town divided into two desperate efforts with those shouts. "Wait for Gabriel!" "No! We must make for Breag! Gabriel will come!" Most made one of those choices. They who stayed hid and listened to the others run away, a shouting and stamping descent into gravid silence. They'd locked themselves in to wait. Some looked out over the hours with hope torn into horror at their neighbors coming back to life in the streets. The sun set. All throughout the night windows shattered and people screamed as the dead broke in and broke out. Some changed their minds and ventured into the poison, always to return. Some gave themselves away by weeping. The sun crossed the sky again before a more lasting quiet fell over Moreau, a stretch of silence in which the staunchest holdouts and the safest corners met their inevitable ends from dehydration. The flight to Breag Bog faced 2 sleepless days by foot over the heath, chased by tireless ghouls. But they had a favorable wind, and there was a cruel certainty in their numbers and the distance if they kept moving. At over 2,000 men, women, and children, there simply weren't enough of the fast ones to catch them all. A mass of younger Bowrons set the flight's pace to a hard walk. Any slower than that were caught. The older Bowrons skittered in the gap like spiders on the web, straight to the weakest and the loyal. They'd spend precious time with their captured lights, turning them over and picking at the shadows while the other lights swept away. Those who died on the walk did so holding on to a strong desire. We must make it to Breag. They made other final wishes, prayers, and pleas, but that desire was particular to what they would become. It told where to go. When their eyes filled with ink and the smoke rolled in their lungs, that desire remained as an instinctual memory. Something important is in the bog. To the northeast, where the green heath dipped into misty peat before it elevated into the gray mountains, Clan Breag had built a village of simple circular huts out of mud bricks, bone, and hide. In the past, they'd followed herds of giant elk across the countryside as a way of life, terrorizing the towns and settlements in their path, and earning reputations as savage warrior nomads and thieves. Over the course of generations, they domesticated the elk, started a settlement of their own, and left the past behind. The elk were 7 monstrous feet tall at the shoulder and had palmate antlers that could serve as banquet platters, sometimes 12 feet across from furthest point to point. They were the center of Breag culture. Called Great War Moose, though really a deer, they were meat, milk, and mounts, shelter, weapons, and living symbols of strength. Lonnie sat high over his, Rotbach, on a tremendous bone and leather saddle that was almost a throne, hinged into the antlers with levers and thongs for driving. Lonnie was a typical clansman, hardy, beard and hair long and untamed, clad from throat to toe in coarse elk fur, brown and black. He looked like he'd burst out of his animal's back. The pair rode in surging leaps over the spongy turf, up a low rise into the village, and right to the hut of the chiefs. Lonnie climbed down a ladder of stirrups and then punched the door a few times. It was a hard leather shield, and, from the way it took his knocks, looked like it could stop a kick from Rotbach. The chief of the men, Histane, opened it, and came out naked. Bulging and hairy, fat and strong and gray, his posture challenged anyone to find a better man than him. Lonnie grinned and bit his tongue before he said what he'd come to say. "You're not going to believe this, but I think Moreau is coming at us." Histane put his fists on his hips and laughed. "What? You've been in the huckleberry jug, haven't you?" Huckleberry whiskey was the drink in Breag. They drank a lot of it. The other chief, the clan sexes governed themselves, was an ample vision of creamy skin on the dark furs inside, named Haukrith. Reclining with her own nude confidence, silver streaks in her tousled hair, she said, "Get out of here, Lonnie." The insides of their huts were like the outsides of their elk, musty fur and antlers everywhere. Under an opening in the roof that kept and let the rain and the smoke out, a peat brick fire smoldered in a ring of stones. Next to it was a water well. Their homes were symbolic of their values, the elk and the earth sheltering the halves of life together, fire and water next to one another, like man and woman. The peat held meaning for them, too. It was a piece of earth that burned even in the damp. Lonnie stopped himself from ogling the one chief to keep the other from punching him. Sorry to be a thorn, but you should come have a look. And we should bring some friends." Histane turned back to Halkrith and shrugged. She rolled her eyes, waved him away, and started dressing. They'd have time later. Their children were grown and in huts of their own. They'd nothing but time on the bog. Lonnie led the chief and 8 other elk-born warriors bounding out over the miles to where what appeared to be an army was trudging through the mist. It was difficult to tell at that distance, but there seemed to be 200 or 300 of them, blue dye popping out like patches of sky in a muddy river. The riders passed glances at each other, considering the odds. Lonnie was disgruntled. "Told you we'd need more than 10. Histane soured at their concerns. Cowards. Then he decided to show them. "Breag! The fire still burns! Look at me! Look at my heart!" He pulled a lever to flick spurs into his 1,900-pound beast machine, Hrothvel, and leapt toward the beleaguered Moroans. He'd cut a road through them. He'd show the others, those youngsters, that warriors still fought with their hair blazing in the wind. "Heya! Hrothvel!" They were impressed. Histane heard them following. But the first Moroan he was close enough to make out was only a woman holding a baby. He pulled back on the levers and slowed to a stop, looking down from Hrothvel's antlers like a man in a tree. The woman gave him a rabidly determined stare and kept walking, clutching her bundle in both arms to her chest, her veins standing out and her teeth bared and clenched. Histane was speechless at the sight of her. She was fleeing something at a fierce walk, having crossed her body's thresholds to save her child. Neither said a word in the passing. The other riders pulled in to watch the strange invasion firsthand. Almost all of them were women with children. There were no men, only a few boys, and those had their little hands hitched in their mothers' veiny grips. The Breag called down to ask what was happening. The Moroan women's throats were so parched they couldn't speak above whispers, and none of them would stop the march. If they'd been able, they might have wailed that their beloved men had sacrificed themselves to give their families more time. Thinking about it made them want to die. Only the urge to protect their young had kept them alive. Some rasped, pointing backwards, but most had driven themselves beyond the ability to communicate. They could only go. The Breag scratched their heads and then rode around to see what hounded the women. 50 yards back, a ruddy skeleton scuttled out of the mist on all fours, its muscles cords that creaked like twisting leather. That time Histane was among the hesitant glances, and it was Lonnie who took action. Lonnie said, It's me! It's me! Heya! Hrotvok! And bounded toward the Bowron. To the other's surprise, it made no attempt to get out of the way. It changed its course to attack. A hush came over them. It charges the great war moose. Hrotvok's antlers lowered, pierced the skinny little devil like a bug on a fork, and lifted it wriggling into the air. Histane cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted, "Brain him, Lonnie!" Lonnie was on it, having already drawn out his bone hammer, a club with a blade of stone lashed into one end. He reared up in the stirrups and brought it down in both hands on the Bowron's head. Spack! A black gout spat out of its skull, and its body went slack. Hrotvok flicked it away like trash. Smiling and spattered with ink, Lonnie raised his weapon and shouted, "Brayog!" They all cheered his victory. And, when more of those devils appeared, the Brayog took up the fight. They weren't idle, whiskey-drinking hut men then. They were a war party. They leapt onto the skittering fiends, stamping them to pieces under the hooves, tossing them from the antlers, and smashing them with bone hammers, all while riding high above the meager smoke. It was easy, until the rotting army of the young approached, 50-1. The warriors nodded eagerly. Odds like those, how welcome they'd become, how good. The great war moose would cut swaths through them, like grooves into the fallow to make bricks, like rolling thunder in the shadows, riders striking from the saddles. Battle! The war party charged, slamming into the crowd of corpses, knocking them into the air, cutting them apart and trampling them. One elk plowed into the middle, spearing too many to lift. His rider drove him hard into a rut of flesh until they stopped, Bowron spilling into their wake. The smoke curled up thick and churning from the young. One warrior and then another fell, gasping for breath, into the grasping death. The Elk-born didn't mourn their fallen. They were fighting, killing, not protecting anything or anyone. They were killing because they loved it, and they were purified by the violence. If they bled, they'd let it flow and nod their heads and swing again. If they burned, they'd let it burn them black, and swing again. The mass of young divided, some limping after separate elk, some broken to a crawl, and some destroyed. The bog was a smoking massacre. The war party bounded over it with lusty battle cries. Heya, Gritstel! The giant elk launched and landed with destruction. Heya, Nathan Sever! Hrothvel and Hrotvok crossed the field back and forth into exhaustion. They took in too much dirty spore. Their mouths foamed, their great lungs rattled, and mucus hung from their nostrils in ropes. They'd given everything, and were dying. Lonnie and Histane knew it. They'd been fighting side by side. But there were still Bowron in the mist, a few in cerulean blue now. They decided to ride their elk clear to avoid crashing at the enemy's feet. As they plodded, out of breath in the saddle, their hair clumped with sweat and their faces burning from an infection they didn't understand, Histane quoted an old something his father used to say. There we stood, 10 against 1,000. They rushed us, and we slew all 10. He finished it with a wicked grin. Lonnie grinned back, and they laughed and coughed. While their beast drifted on, the riders climbed down and jumped off, bone hammers in hand. Hrothvel and Hrotvok fell less than 100 feet apart, with the tremor of giants returned to earth. An hour's walk away to the north, there were comfy huts, good frisky women and whiskey. To the south, there was only battle. Lonnie offered a more common Brayog adage in response to what the chief had said. If you're gonna get dirty, get filthy. Histane bared his teeth. They charged back into the smoke together, shouting, Brayog! 3 answering cries came from the elk-born alive, and one of those still rode high, raining blows. Halkrith's black and silver was pulled back into a bun with bone hairsticks, the ends beautifully carved into elk skulls. Her cold gaze narrowed in the firelight on a Merowan she had by the collar. She gave her a little shake. Where are our men? The woman's eyes rolled under their swollen lids like bloody eggs. Her mouth stayed open when she spoke. It was a breathy, feverish whisper. They're dead. Halkrith leaned in closer. Who killed them? Ghosts. Every Brayog in the hut groaned. No one believed that, but that was all any of these Merowans had to say. Halkrith dropped her the 6 inches to the fur and stomped outside. The entire village had gathered around, learning of the emergency. Halcreth shouted, "This one's got the same story as the rest. Put all the Google eyes together and stay away from them. They're sick or something. Start locking yourselves in. Whatever's done for them's on its way for us." The women nodded and went about their business. She'd been barking orders at them since the Merowans arrived. The men, however, just stood there looking confused. Histane or Lonnie usually told them what to do. Halcreth shouted into a fury at them. "Your chief is out on the bog! Go get him!" They passed glances around at each other to see if any of them would follow a woman's orders. There was a lot of open-handed shrugging and head-scratching until they did. Then all 47 remaining warriors readied their saddles. Halcreth pulled her son out of them and said, "If your father's dead, kill the ones who did it, and after that, take it back to their blood." She'd won an evil vengeance for Histane's death, and, though only 17, her son quickly swore that he'd grant it. John knelt in the church, meditating on the past. He reached a point of clarity, stood, and went right to knocking on the library door. When Abraham opened it, John said, "I need 2 weeks to go home for a visit." He hadn't asked for leave in more than 18 years. Abraham didn't give it a moment's thought. "Go right ahead. Take 3. John nodded and strode out, an embodiment of determination. From back in the library, without a mark on his face, Michael said, "May I have some personal time as well?" Abraham frowned at him. "Wherever would you go?" Michael never really asked for leave either, but the church was practically surrounded by his family. Michael knew what he was about to say would irritate Abraham. It gave him pleasure he tried not to show. "This month is that festival for Gabriel in Moreau." Abraham grumbled. Then he held up 2 rude fingers. "You get 2 weeks." Michael pulled his chin into his throat at the sight of the offensive gesture. He walked into the stable while John was saddling the pinto. The older man offered an explanation without being asked. "It's been so quiet lately. I keep thinking of my nephew. It feels time to heal the breach." Michael nodded on his way to saddle Ares. "Ah, very good. I'll ride out with you until we part ways then." There was unspoken warmth in their friendship. John had been almost a father to Michael over the years, and Michael had been close to a son. They shared some agreeable riding, campfires, and conversation. Then they stood next to their horses at the crossroads where the dirt lane led off through the field to John's farm. The southern sky darkened on the horizon from the coming of an oceanic storm. They'd be soaked before long. John swung into the saddle with a sad smile. Wouldn't it be something if Horace just walked out and waved? He didn't expect it to happen. Michael got up too. "I hope he does." John gave him a curious smirk. "What could possibly interest you at that festival? All you'll do is brood." Michael smiled. "It was the company on the ride out I was interested in." They laughed. "And I don't mind their music. They play those lutes. Hopefully it isn't ruined by a bunch of drunken partygoers. I really do hate parties." John said, "Oh, I hate them too," pleasantly mocking the other's attitude. Michael glanced south and saw someone staggering toward them on the road. "God's mercy, here's one of them now, barely on his feet. Just look at that blue shirt. Garish. Merowans really have no humility whatsoever." He shook his head and clucked his tongue. Then a lash of smoke crossed his face. He brought his hands up and started coughing. The spores brushed into the pinto at the same time, and she gave a start. John's eyes widened. His skittish filly was about to bolt. He took a firm hold on the reins immediately and completely concerned. "Easy, girl. Fwah!" She took off to the north with John shouting, "Whoa! Stop! Stop! God, you stupid horse!" Michael had endured the pain long enough. He opened the way, seeing in that moment what it was. Plague. He snapped a look at the staggering Merowan, jumped down from Ares, and ran over, unfastening a gauntlet as he went. They met before his hand was free. The Bowron's aggression and appearance came as a shock. Michael had to shove it away to get the glove off. It came right back at him, and they wrestled, him trying to heal it trying to bite and thrash him. Michael was stronger. He threw it down and pinned its rotten head against the road with his bare hand, searching, confounded. It was empty. He tried and tried to find the way as its poison bled into the wind, and as he neared the decision to destroy it. Whoever it had been before, it was a devil now. He picked it up by that blue shirt and flung it 20 feet out into the field. It flailed through the air, smoke tracing an arc behind it, and then, flump, it got right back up and kept coming, while Michael went to Ares for the sword. When John returned, the Pinto was unconvinced and ready to bolt again. Michael stood in a pint of ink between the Bowron's smoking halves, wiping his blade. John didn't know what he was seeing. "Michael, you killed him?" Michael turned around, showing his naked hand. "No! It's plague! The way wouldn't open. It wasn't there." John snapped a look at the road home. Michael's mind was racing. The corpse boiled contagion into the air. He knelt to examine it and said, "John, go to your family. See that they're safe from this." "I can't. If it was plague, he couldn't justify going home to a remote place like the farm. It was days away from the larger populations at risk. "I can't go home, can I? Is my son already dead? Is the last of my blood gone?" Michael stood up with a golden glow in his eyes, mail sparkling on either side of the white. "John, as the Templar's consecrate, I command you to investigate the farm down this road. Go." John's emotions fought against his sense of duty. Though he wasn't a model paladin, he'd given up much for the Circle, and believed they stood for the right. The crossed roads were too many. He let Michael's order point the way, turned his Pinto toward the farm, and rode. The storm came and went. On a woodland path east of Antioch, birds on the chirp, Samuel and Joseph rode toward Mount Tabor sawmill. They'd left the church the day before. Samuel sat astride his red roan, Rascal, worrying that Abraham would be the one to go to Salem, knowing the way to there led through Tabor. What will Abraham do when he discovers I've betrayed him? Joseph bounced along in tow on the DB cow. "You know, after I failed loyalty, I almost gave up and went home to Somerset. I was devastated." Samuel smiled, missing those front teeth, and put his other thoughts aside. "You hadn't failed loyalty, Joseph." "Oh, yes, I did. Abraham let me have it in the worst way. I don't know where you were." Samuel chuckled at him. "No, you didn't. It's that crucible that's a betrayal. You're told you failed for one unfair reason or another, to test your resolve with the injustice of it. Why was it again that Abraham let you have it?" Joseph's face was open disbelief. "For eating at the cauldron on a Tuesday." Samuel laughed. "It's not funny. You didn't think that was strange? A little too picky? I thought it was something I'd missed in my studies. I've been killing myself over that." "Well, it's a good thing you didn't go another year with that attitude. Abraham would have held you back again if you didn't at least complain." Joseph shook the bulk of the lie from his head. "Loyalty takes more than a year?" "Oh, yes. It's the long one. You never really fail it, unless you give up." That made Joseph angry. "I don't see how that tests a man's loyalty at all." "It doesn't, of course." "What?" "Well, none of them do. You can't test for a man's virtues. The crucibles are meant to have one or another in mind, but the only thing any of them really find is resolve. We're not especially honest or loyal or tolerant." Samuel chuckled, remembering Gabriel's dynamic failing of that one. "We might have some of those qualities, sure. Well, not all the time, of course." "What are you saying?" "The crucibles only test your determination. That isn't the spirit of them now. They're intended to find virtuous men. But the reality, what I've come to find, is that determination was all we ever needed." "Do the others see it that way?" "Only Abraham believes in the Circle's righteousness anymore. Even Michael's had his eyes opened." Joseph was shocked. He'd counted himself among the virtuous elite, among the white knights, since he was 13 years old. "All these years, Well, there it is." Samuel nodded. "Even then, it's the Templar's decision in the end. If he doesn't think you're worth ordination, he won't waste any time with you at all. Where's the virtue in one man's opinion of another?" "I can't believe Thomas didn't tell me." "Thomas is a prat." Joseph shook his head, the shock becoming amusement. "You didn't tell me either." Samuel gave him a beefy, cheesy grin. Joseph said, "At the very least, I can take comfort from Abraham having wasted so much time on me. He must have really liked me after all." They chuckled, and then they laughed. They rode east and up into the mountains toward the deep forest on the northern face of Mount Tabor. Samuel divulged other interesting secrets as they wound through the rocks and the trees. Then, to Joseph's further confusion, Samuel turned them off the way onto a smaller, wilder path that descended southward into the valley. Joseph looked back, scratched his head, looked at Samuel, and then back again. He said, "Sir, I think we're going to lose time if we go around the mountain first." Samuel smiled, but it was a sad distraction. The secrets he had yet to tell were harder for him. "Have you ever had huckleberry whiskey, Joseph?" Joseph paused. "I can't say that I have." Samuel nodded, remembering the taste. "Best drink in the world. It's because of the peat smoke. When you dry the grain over a peat fire, it makes the liquor earthy later on, gives it a peatiness." "Peatiness. I see. Shouldn't we be getting to Tabor? We're headed the wrong way. What's going on?" Rascal stayed the course. "I never planned to go there. We're going to Breog." Joseph's eyes expanded. Then his arms flapped out and he said, "Why? Why in the world would you want to go there? Now?" "Because I think they're still alive." "But you'll be days out of the way. Tabor will fall. The smoke will get through and everyone in the north will die." "The smoke travels on the wind. Saving Tabor won't make a difference." Joseph had a creeping fear that his master had gone insane. "Does saving Breog make a difference?" "It does." "Why? This doesn't make any sense. Those savages aren't worth breaking the line for." "I disagree." "Oh, well, that's all that matters then, isn't it?" Joseph clenched and turned away. The original plan had given him hope for his own people in the north. Samuel was abandoning them. Joseph felt that he couldn't argue and that he had no choice but to follow. He was powerless. Samuel tried to explain. "The smoke is on the wind. We can't stop it. Nothing can. Wherever I plant myself, that's where people get to live. I'm not going to waste that on filthy, lawless Tabor. When everything ends, I want this to be the decision I made, right or wrong." "But why the clan? I agree with you about Tabor. To hell with that place. But why not go to Somerset, where I'm from? They're good people. Why go to Breog?" "Because I'm Breog." Joseph was stunned. Samuel handled it gently. "Shave and haircut. We look like everybody else." Joseph didn't know what to say, so he said something stupid. But Breog isn't allowed in the circle." "Well, I lied to get in, didn't I?" It took Joseph a long time to respond. Out of the 5, he'd always been closest to Samuel. He knew now there'd been lies between them, but he'd known Samuel's kindness and patience as well. Those hadn't been lies. Joseph hadn't known he'd ever met anyone from Breog. "I feel like I've never known anything." "I'm sorry, Joseph." It was only an apology. The silence between them didn't last long. They were still friends. Some things just had to be accepted. Samuel answered Joseph's questions, and they spent 2 days on the ride, putting the pieces into place. At night, by the campfire, Samuel read his book of Bauron out loud. By the time they reached the hillock over which they'd be able to see the village, Joseph's hopes were on Samuel's side. They left their animals at the bottom and dropped to a crawl at the top to spy. The earthen huts out and below were surrounded by hundreds of Breog and Maroan Bauron. Peat smoke came out of some of the openings in the roofs. The people within had been burning chunks of their walls to keep warm. Joseph said, "Look at all of them gathered around the huts. You were right. They're still alive. And those devils are waiting for them, just like Horus under the tree. I can't believe they haven't starved." "You can last a long time without food if you've got water. Those huts are built strong with their wells inside." Joseph was encouraged. "Surely this is an even better cutoff than Tabor." Samuel nodded. "It's much further south, and the plague will stick in this bog's valley like flour in a wet spoon." "All right, what are we going to do?" "We aren't going to do anything. You need to stay as far away from this as possible. I won't be able to stop fighting to give you hospital, or protect you while you're asleep." Samuel rubbed his mouth, thinking. "There are hundreds of them down there. I can't handle them all at once. Michael says they pile on top of you until you can't move. I have to split them up somehow." Joseph got an idea. He looked back at Rascal for a moment, the horse known to throw paladins, and gauged his own horsemanship against his chances.
I can ride Rascal through and draw them out. You can take them once they're scattered.
Samuel said, That's too dangerous. But he couldn't think of a way to do it alone.
What are you going to do then?
I don't know.
Let me help you.
Samuel paused.
Are you sure?
Joseph remembered what Samuel said 2 days before. When everything ends, I want this to be the decision I made, right or wrong. It would be an honor. Samuel's chest swelled with love and respect, and he embraced Joseph. Then he said, Rascal's no great war moose, but you've the fire of a rider. Joseph didn't fully understand what that meant, but it sounded like a powerful compliment. They smiled at each other and went about forming a plan. The cow could graze. Samuel left his scabbard on the hill. Joseph sat in Rascal's saddle. Samuel reminded him, Hold your breath when you come through, and don't bring them back around until I'm out of sight. We don't want to give them too much to think about. Joseph nodded. Samuel went on, worrying over his young friend. And don't spur him too much, or jerk him. That's what makes him pitch. Rascal likes to have a say in where he goes. Joseph nodded again, ready. Good luck, Joseph. You too. Then Joseph screeched out, Hee-haw, Rascal! And galloped toward the village, whooping, hollering, and raising a ruckus. Samuel stayed low and watched. Sure enough, the Bowron peeled away from the huts and went after the horse, some of them with surprising speed. Samuel noted to himself, Those must be the old ones. They flooded out of the village like ants out of a mound. Then Samuel ran down without a sound and destroyed the few that had stayed. His technique wasn't as clean as Michael's. Samuel swung a Callaghan like a club. He swatted them around, breaking more bones than he cut, but he got the job done. Then he hid behind a hut and waited. Rascal and Joseph shot by a few minutes later, kicking up mud and leading a line behind them. Hee-haw, Samuel! It's working! It's working! Samuel smiled at Joseph's bravado. Then he rushed out at the line's end and chopped 20 of them to bits without as much as a grunt. The rest pulled away, and he ran back in to wait for the next pass. A nearby door opened a crack, and gaunt faces peeked out. Samuel turned on them, eyes glowing, and slammed that door shut. From behind the hard leather, they asked him who he was. Samuel replied, Shh! I'm a wizard, so you'd better stay inside. They gasped and repeated it to each other. Horse and rider flew by again and again in a wide figure 8 that crossed at Samuel's hiding place. Samuel popped out to destroy the end of the line each time. The corpses piled there. They were little more than skeletons under blue shirts and elk furs, and they hardly smoked at all. But they did smoke. A cloud built at the intersection, and Joseph rode through it like a breeze, carrying it with him. The infection would have been impossible for him to avoid, no matter how long he could hold his breath. His boisterousness lessened as the painful spore crept into his body through his eyes, nose, and mouth. The paralysis began. Joseph leaned forward in the saddle farther and farther until he was lying down, clinging to Rascal's mane and cooing deliriously.
You're a good boy, aren't you? You're not a bad horse. There you go. There's a good boy. Only 1 or 2 more.
While Joseph faded away, Rascal kept playing the game, trailing them in a figure 8 unguided. Then Joseph's grip failed, and he fell, but Rascal stayed the course. The Bowron didn't have long with Somerset's light. The horse passed by without a rider. Samuel's face turned the color of ash. He rushed out, saw the last of the monsters gathered in one spot, and started screaming at them. Here! It's me! To me! Here! They came. Samuel finished them like Michael's story, moving in a backward circle. Joseph lay motionless at that path's end, his yellow plaid and acolyte's tabard torn and muddy. Samuel rushed over to him and knelt, fumbling with a gauntlet, but he could already tell it was too late. He tried to open the way, but his brave young friend was dead. Rascal trotted up and snorted. Samuel snapped. You threw him, didn't you? You threw him, you miserable animal! He stumbled up with his Callaghan and took a vicious swing on the run. If Rascal hadn't flinched, the stroke would have opened him from ribs to tail. Instead, it bit 2 inches into his flank through the saddle. The horse squealed and took off, spraying blood. Samuel dropped his weapon, fell to his knees, and moaned into his hands. He was a dark man when he returned to the village that night. He walked from hut to hut with a torch, punching the doors to knock. If they answered from inside, he'd give them hospital, and made sure they stayed safe. If they did not answer, if they pounded and scratched and tried to get out, Samuel put his torch to the hut and turned it into an oven. Since the walls were made of peat, they smoldered even in the damp. That is the end of chapter 31. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can follow the link at the top of my website, www.williameharlan.com, and purchase the full novel from Amazon in ebook format for $2.99 or as a paperback for $12.99. Thanks for listening. Tune in next week for chapter 32, A Crucible of Resolve.